Hello everyone, Mitch Albers here. In this biocast, we're going to take a look at the process of cellular respiration, where the cell converts the energy of glucose to the energy of ATP so that it can do cellular work, such as building proteins for protein synthesis. In this segment, we're going to just introduce you to the overall process of that's occurring for cell respiration. So with that, let's get started. What I'm going to do is just give you a brief overview of the overall chemical reaction. We'll talk about the energy conversion. We'll talk about the role of some electron carriers, and we'll review the structure of the mitochondrion so we know specifically where these events are taking place in the cell. So let's get started with the overall process of cell respiration. Cellular respiration is all about converting the energy of glucose to the energy of ATP. Okay, so for some reason, glucose as a direct energy source, that wasn't the road that evolution took. There's a lot of energy tied up in a glucose molecule, and for a lot of the kinds of work that cells do, whether it's transporting things across the cell membrane, catalyzing chemical reactions, glucose as a direct energy source would be a little bit overkill. And if there's one thing that we've learned about cells and how cells survive out there, is that they have to be relatively efficient. And so using glucose as a direct energy source wasn't a very efficient way of transferring energy to do the kinds of work that gets done in our cells. So it took on a path of evolving into this process called cellular respiration. And the best analogy I can give is that if you could think of glucose as a sponge, and you submerge a sponge in water and it soaks up all that water. Imagine the water being energy. Well, the cell is going to efficiently wring out, instead of water, think of the water as energy, wring out as much available energy to do work as it possibly can. Okay? And so one of the things that we're going to see is that cellular respiration is a metabolic pathway. It's not a one-step reaction. There's many reactions, and the purpose of that metabolic pathway is to help maximize the energy production we're going to get out of that glucose molecule. So glucose is going to come in through your diet. Oxygen you're going to breathe in from the atmosphere. Okay, and in the process we convert, we metabolize the glucose and convert it to carbon dioxide, which is going to be a waste. And it's what you exhale when you breathe out through your lungs. We produce water, which is mostly what your body is made of. So water just gets added to your body, and we convert it to useful energy. Okay, and ATP energy is that kind of energy that's going to be used to do work in the cell. Okay, and so this diagram that we used back in chapter 8 is familiar with us. So we're looking at glucose here. Okay, and we'll bring in oxygen from the atmosphere. We breathe in oxygen all the time. We're taking in glucose because glucose is in our diet. It's in the foods that we eat. And through cellular respiration, we're going to produce the products of carbon dioxide and water. Okay? And in the process, we are then going to be converting some of that energy to do work. Okay? Some of that energy that's tied up in the glucose will be converted to ATP energy. Okay? And what energy is being transferred is the energy that's transferred to bond that third phosphate onto ADP so we can synthesize ATP. Okay? Then we have the right energy molecule to do work in the cell, and that would include like building proteins. And so we see this nice energy coupling kind of reaction, and recall that overall cellular respiration is going to be an exergonic reaction. So overall, we're going to see an energy loss. And whenever we see a conversion, we're going to see some of that energy lost as heat. So in terms of the overall reaction above, we could also indicate that there's going to be some heat loss. Okay. Overall, the energy conversion of glucose to ATP is about 40% efficient. Okay? That means a whole bunch of that energy is going to be lost in the form of heat. Now, at first, you might think, well, that doesn't seem all that efficient. But if you look at out there, think of like the typical car driving down the road. How efficient are they? You know, maybe 18–20%. We've got new hybrid cars that are a little bit better than that, but they're not all that efficient. And a lot of the kinds of things that we humans have created in terms of energy efficiency, you know, we have to abide by those laws of thermodynamics, and whether you're in biology or creating man-made kinds of things, the laws of thermodynamics are at play there. So, so overall, cellular respiration is simply converting the energy of glucose to the energy of ATP. So let's talk a little bit more about energy conversion. If you are needing to buy something, a good or service, well, in the way that our society is made up is we need cash to do that kind of buying, purchasing things. Okay, so if you have a job, you get a paycheck. Okay, but you can't take your paycheck down to Target and go to the cash register and buy, you know, a T-shirt. You're going to have to go to the bank first and cash your check. And in that process, what they are doing is they're acting as a converter. They're converting the monetary value of that paycheck into cash. Okay, and cash is the standard currency that we use to buy goods and services. Okay, so if we can use that kind of analogy, think of ATP as the energy currency of the cell. In order to get any kind of work done, it has to spend ATP energy to do that work. Okay, and the way that that works is we take in foods in our diet, and in the types of foods that we have in our diet, it includes glucose, sugars, and we breathe in oxygen all the time. And then our cell acts as kind of like the bank. Through the process of cellular respiration, cellular respiration is converting the energy of food into the energy of ATP so that we can do the work that we need to have done. So that's the basic analogy of how the energy conversion works in our cells from glucose to ATP. Okay, so again, what we're involving this energy conversion of converting the energy of glucose to the energy of ATP so that we can perform work such as protein synthesis in the cell. And we've been talking about cells being protein factories as their primary responsibility, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening here. And through these energy conversions to get that work done, we are abiding by the second law of thermodynamics. We're seeing energy loss at various steps along the way, and overall we're seeing that in terms of the overall energy and in terms of free energy, that our system here is decreasing in free energy, which indicates that it's an exergonic type of reaction. And overall, if we were calculating our free energy situation using our Gibbs free energy equation, we should see some value less than 0 for the overall reaction. Okay? All right, so let's move on. So if we want to just overview what's going on in cellular respiration, as I mentioned earlier, it's a metabolic pathway, okay? And it's going to take us through various areas of the cell. So we're going to start out in the cytoplasm, okay? And that's where we can conceptualize cellular respiration into 3 major phases, starting with glycolysis. The second major phase is the what we call the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And then the third phase is something that we call oxidative phosphorylation, or sometimes we will also call it the electron transport system. And we might abbreviate that as ETS. Okay? And what I'm going to do in these series of videos is go through these 3 phases of cellular respiration in individual videos. There is an in-between step here that connects us from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle, and we call that oxidative or pyruvic oxidation. We're going to oxidize the 2 pyruvates, which are the products of glycolysis. Okay? And pyruvic oxidation, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport all occur within the mitochondria of the cell. Back in the cell chapter, we talked about the mitochondrion as the powerhouse organelle. This is where energy is produced, specifically ATP energy. Okay, and in just a moment, I'll review the structure of the mitochondrion and talk more in detail about where these things are happening. Okay, but we just talked about energy conversion, and so if we start the overall process, we're going to start with glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar. Okay, and we're going to split that into 2 3-carbon sugars that are called pyruvates. Those 2 3-carbon sugars are then going to go into the mitochondrion and go through this pyruvate oxidation, and they're going to get converted to something called acetyl-CoA. Along the line here, we're going to lose some carbon dioxide, and the acetyl then will become a 2-carbon molecule. The coenzyme A is going to be responsible for shuttling the 2-carbon acetyl into the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is a cycle, so where we start is where we're going to end. We go around the cycle, okay? And the kinds of things that are going to end up getting produced out of the citric acid cycle, one is going to be carbon dioxide, okay? And again, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the cell into the blood, into our lungs, and we're going to exhale it and get rid of it as a waste product of cellular respiration. But most importantly, what gets produced here are electron carriers, okay? And there's 2 different types of electron carriers. One is called NADH, and the other is FADH2, okay? Now, there are NADHs that will be coming out of glycolysis, and there also is some NADH produced during pyruvate oxidation, okay? And all these NADHs go to the last phase, which is oxidative phosphorylation. And what's happening here is that a lot of the energy that's tied up in the glucose molecule is going to get converted, transferred to these electron carriers. And those electron carriers are going to play a major role in how we produce ATP at this last phase of cellular respiration called oxidative phosphorylation. Okay? We do produce some ATP directly out of glycolysis, okay? We're going to get 2 ATPs out of glycolysis, as well out of the Krebs cycle. We're going to get some ATP produced there, about 2 ATPs. And if we add everything up, we should see on a, in terms of energy production, we're going to get a lot more ATP energy produced during that third phase of oxidative phosphorylation. We should see about 32 ATPs produced at the end. Okay? Now, the way that the ATP gets produced is quite different. Okay? During glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, the way that we're going to produce ATP is through something called substrate level phosphorylation. And the way that we're going to produce ATP during the electron transport system or oxidative phosphorylation is going to be called just that, oxidative phosphorylation. And the way that the ATP is produced between those two are quite different. And we'll point those things out as we go along the way. So this is, again, it's a pathway. It's a metabolic pathway. There's lots of steps that we're going to go through. And right now we're just kind of overviewing what this whole process is all about. Okay. Now the other thing is that if we looked at our overall chemical reaction, right? So glucose, C6H12O6 plus oxygen. Then we look at our products, which are going to be carbon dioxides and water, plus energy. Okay, and overall we're looking at about 36 ATPs to get produced. Okay, so our glucose molecule is what goes in at the very beginning with glycolysis. Okay, our carbon dioxides are produced during pyruvate oxidation and the Krebs cycle. So we can kind of just see where that's happening. The water that gets produced, okay, is going to come out at the end of the electron transport system as a product. The ATP, as I mentioned, we get a little bit of ATP trickling in through glycolysis, a little bit more during the Krebs cycle, but the bulk of it here is going to be during oxidative phosphorylation. That's where we're going to produce the most ATP energy. So we've got that as a product accounted for. And then the oxygen, okay? The oxygen that you breathe in to keep you alive and to keep this process going, interestingly, doesn't go in at glycolysis. In fact, in the cytosol, it's a low oxygen environment. So we're not seeing oxygen occurring during glycolysis. We don't see oxygen involved with pyruvate oxidation or the Krebs cycle, okay? It's going to be at the end of what's called the electron transport system. That's where we're going to see oxygen going into the process and coming out as water. Okay? And we'll explain later on, but electron transport is all about transferring electrons. And one of the things that oxygen is characteristically can do is it has a strong pull on electrons. It's highly electronegative, and its job is going to be to pull electrons off the end of the electron transport chain, and we'll talk about those details, but that's the role of oxygen. And all the oxygen that you breathe in ends up making water, which is mostly what your cell is. Okay, so that's a brief overview of what we're getting ourselves into here in cellular respiration. So let's move on. There's a couple other some introductory things that we need to kind of cover before we dive into the details. All right, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the role of these electron carriers. Okay, if you remember some basic chemistry, and we've talked about redox reactions, right? Reduction, oxidation reactions, okay? And so when we're studying the electron carrier NADH, Okay? Well, when we see NAD as a plus sign here, this is the oxidized form of this electron carrier. And what that's telling us is right here, okay, NAD, and we're going to call it NAD. It stands for nicotinamine adenine dinucleotide. Okay, so the adenine is the nitrogenous base. We've seen that before in DNA and ATP. It has dinucleotide, so it's kind of like two nucleotides, and then it has this nicotinamine end of the molecule. And this is the area where the oxidation has occurred. So off this nitrogen, it's indicating that it's lost an electron, and therefore is been oxidized. Okay. Now, when we have an oxidation reaction, we're going to see a reduction reaction. Okay, so think about if you eat an apple, that's part of your diet. And as we digest the apple, we're going to then use the energy tied up in the sugar molecules of the apple to reduce our NAD+. Okay, and so for the reduction, we're going to see the addition of hydrogen atoms. Okay, so when we go from NAD+, and then we go this way in the reaction, we're going to see the reduction of NAD+ to NADH. This is the reduced form of the electron carrier. Okay, and what we've done is we filled in that electron hole that was lost. Now, how do we do that? Well, think about this. Okay, so we're going to take two hydrogens from foods in our diet and think about what two hydrogens are. Two hydrogens are what? They're two protons with a lone electron. Okay, so this is a hydrogen atom, and this is a hydrogen atom. Okay, so first of all, we're going to fill in that electron hole. Okay, so we're going to replace that electron that was lost back here. Okay, so from these two hydrogens, let's just take one of those electrons, and we're going to fill in that electron hole right there. Okay, then what we're left with is a hydrogen proton. Okay, and that's this proton out here. Okay, then you'll also see that there's another hydrogen added on here, and that's indicated right here. And that's going to be this full hydrogen here. Okay, so when we see NADH with that hydrogen added, then we know this is the reduced form of the electron carrier. But we also always got to remember that it's carrying this hydrogen proton along with it. So we will abbreviate NADH as the reduced form of the electron carrier, but it always represents its NADH plus a hydrogen proton. Okay? This will just be the abbreviated form that you're going to see in our discussions and in the textbook and so forth. Okay? So, this is a reversible reaction. We can go back this way, and which means that we can take two hydrogens away and revert back to our oxidized state or form of the electron carrier. Okay? And so the role of NADH, okay, is that it's going to pick up from something electrons. It's going to come in as NAD+, pick up that electron, and get reduced to NADH. It's then going to take those electrons and transfer them to some other location and drop those electrons off in the form of two hydrogens. Okay? So if there's two hydrogens, that means there's going to be two electrons. And then when it does that, it comes out as our oxidized form of NAD+. Okay, so it's simply acting as an electron carrier. And one of the things that you ought to remember about electrons is that electrons are out away at some distance away from the nucleus of an atom. Okay, and you know that the further the distance an electron is away from its nucleus, the greater amount of energy that that electron possesses. Okay, and so NADH is going to carry electrons that are high in free energy. And we're going to see how the cell has utilized those high energy electrons to helping get work done for the production of ATP. Okay, so again, this is just a simple review of oxidation redox reactions. We simply call them redox reactions. And we'll see a number of examples of redox occurring during cellular respiration. Okay. The last thing we'll review here for the introduction is the mitochondrion, the structure of the mitochondrion, and where these different things are occurring during cell respiration. So remember, the mitochondrion is a double membrane bound organelle. It has an outer membrane, and it also has an inner membrane. Okay, and then it has a space between the outer and inner membrane, and we're going to call that the intermembrane space. This label calls it the intermembrane compartment, or we can just call that the intermembrane space. Okay. In the middle is what's called the matrix. Okay, and the matrix is the best way to describe it is just a chemical soup of enzymes and ions and water, and this is where pyruvate oxidation occurs. It's also the location where the Krebs cycle occurs. So all the enzymes of the Krebs cycle are present in the mitochondrial matrix. Remember, glycolysis happens out in the cytoplasm of the cell, and then when it produces the pyruvate, the pyruvates then get transferred across the mitochondrial membranes and into the mitochondrial matrix for pyruvate oxidation, which then leads to the Krebs cycle. And then, so if we're looking at the phases, glycolysis is phase 1, the Krebs cycle is phase 2, and then the electron transport system is a system of proteins that are embedded into the crista membrane. Remember, the inner membrane is quite folded. Okay, and the purpose of that folding is to produce a lot of internal surface area. And by having a lot of internal surface area, that allows for a lot of these electron transport systems to be built in to the membrane. Okay, so electron transport system, or so this is the third phase. We also call this oxidative phosphorylation. As the site where that's occurring in the cell. Okay, so we're going to involve all these different areas of the mitochondrion, and we're also going to be looking a lot what's happening in this intermembrane space, because when we start producing energy, particularly during oxidative phosphorylation, we're going to see the movement, particularly of hydrogen protons from the matrix into that intermembrane space. And then that's going to create what's called a high energy potential, and those hydrogen protons will want to diffuse back to the matrix. And when they come back to the matrix, that's going to drive oxidative phosphorylation, where we're going to produce ATP. And we'll again, I'm very over. This is a 10,000-foot view of what's really occurring to generalize, but we'll dive into the details when we get there. So there's just a kind of a review of the structure of the mitochondrion, and overall an introduction to what we're getting into here in cellular respiration. So in the next video segment, we'll start going through those different phases, and we'll begin with glycolysis. So stay tuned and watch the glycolysis video.